Let me establish if everybody is aware of William O'Donnell, one of the ancestors of the O'Donnell family. From what I understand, everybody is descendant from William.
We have a lot of Williams.
Okay,
We have an
let me
uncle.
start with Pap O'Donnell. Everybody know about Pap?
Yep.
John Henry?
Yep.
Everybody knows his father?
Silas.
Silas? Everybody knows Silas's father?
No.
That's William. Okay. Now, William's father was Henry O'Donnell, and he was born in 1787. He died in 1877. He was a saddler by trade. Okay. Just want to clarify that so you guys know who I'm talking about and what generation I'm at, because I'm going to tell a couple of stories. My first story is about Daniel O'Donnell. Daniel O'Donnell was a brother of William. So he was an uncle of Silas and a granduncle of Pap O'Donnell. Now, Daniel O'Donnell, he was born in 1838 in Perry County, New German town, and he married Nancy Jane Cope. And they looked like a pretty normal, average couple. Obviously planning to have a family. They had a little farm. And as life moves on, they had their first daughter, Rebecca. She was born in 1856. Unfortunately, she died of typhoid fever in 1859. But at that time, they already had two other daughters, Margaret and Emma. After that, they had another daughter, Ida. And the youngest kid was Michael O'Donnell. He was born in 1864. And that's where it gets a little bit interesting as far as Daniel is concerned. So up until that time, as I imagine, they had a pretty happy life. And they had children, they had a little farm, and then things started to go wrong for Daniel because the Civil War came along. And he was drafted a first time in 1863, but he dodged his service because he lied about his age. And he made him believe he was already 38 years old, so he was not eligible. So they let him go. He was drafted a second time in the spring of 1864. He was not able to get away from that one because it was almost a year after the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Union troops were decimated, and Lincoln was organizing a draft to get more men join the army. And Daniel was one of them. So, I have to make notes because I don't have everything in my head. So I have to look a little bit here. So Daniel, and now of course I cannot find it. So Daniel was drafted in the spring of 1864, and that was when Nancy Jane Cope, his wife, was just pregnant with the youngest child, Michael. Daniel deserts from Camp Biddle, where he was stationed. Camp Biddle is in Carlisle. It's still there, and it's a museum now. It's worthwhile going there. If you have a chance to go there, you should visit it. It's pretty neat. So he was in Camp Biddle. He was not assigned to any unit or regiment, probably waiting for that. But he knew his wife was pregnant, and until that time, he only had daughters. So he was probably eager to have a son. So in October, he deserts And I have the strong impression that he deserts because his wife gave birth to his son. And he heard about it, and he probably was thinking, I need to get with my family, and he deserted. In November 1864, he's back in Camp Biddle, still not assigned to any unit or regiment or anything. And he's listed as a deserter, which means that he was under arrest, pretty much, awaiting martial court. Okay, so now back then there were a lot of deserters. Most of them got away with it. They got like a little punishment because Lincoln needed his soldiers. Daniel knew that. He was assigned all kinds of chores in the camp, and one day he was chopping wood for the stove, for the ovens, and he accidentally chopped his foot. So he was wounded. So he could not be sent out to the front. So he stayed in Camp Biddle. In 1865, and I think it was in May when the Civil War ended, Daniel was still in the infirmary of Camp Biddle. A month later, Camp Biddle was closed down on May 27th, 1865. Camp Biddle was closed down. From records, I learned that at that time when the camp closed, there were still, as it was listed in the documents, 5 deserters that were still in the camp. So I imagine Daniel was one of them. He was a deserter, but he was wounded, so he was in the infirmary. But since the camp was disbanded, also the medical staff left. So he had a choice either to go to the local hospital or just go home. I assume he just went home to be with his family, hopefully in the hope that he would get better from his wound. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because on June 5th, which is barely a week later, he dies of his wound. June 5th, Daniel dies. He's buried right outside New Germantown in Fairview Cemetery. If you're in the neighborhood, go there and pay your honors to him. He's one of your ancestors. So he has a big tombstone. His wife is buried there.
Where did you say that is?
Fairview. It's outside New Germantown.
I think Bob and Em took Uncle Sam and Graham and popped down there to see that cemetery one time.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me because they went to that church too at that time also, so that's why they're buried there. Yeah, Rebecca, so his first daughter who died of typhoid fever, she's buried there too. So, okay. So that's the story about Daniel. So his life started out pretty promising with a little farm and probably a good wife and having his first children. The only thing he was missing was a son, but he got a son, Michael. And the interesting thing is, one of Michael's descendants, who ended up in Wisconsin, he was at the O'Donnell reunion here a couple of years ago. So, and through the research he found out who his ancestors were, which was pretty interesting. Now, Daniel had 2 other daughters, Emma and Margaret. So you have to figure Nancy Cope was left with very young children as a widow, which at that time, with no welfare or social security available, was very hard. And for her it was impossible to raise 5 children, Emma, Margaret, 4 children. So she decided to send Emma and Margaret to an orphanage. And they went to the Tressler orphanage in Lloydsville, also in that area there of New Germantown. It still exists. Right now it's a youth development center. It's a pretty fancy name for pretty much the same thing. It's an orphanage. So So the two daughters went to an orphanage in Louisville. From there, Emma and Margaret were transferred to an orphanage in Harrisburg, Whitehall, Soldiers' Orphanage. And they got some education there, but the rule of that orphanage was when you turned 16, you had to leave. You turn 16, you have to leave. So you either find a job as a servant or you marry as a girl. So, by the way, they are called the 16ers. When you look up Camp Hill Orphanage, that's what they're called, the 16ers. So they had to leave at that age. And since they were two girls and they get married, they changed their last name changes, which made it very difficult to track them down. So for a while there, they disappeared out of sight. I couldn't find them anywhere, but finally I dug them up and I found them. And they both ended up in Nebraska, Omaha. And I found a little newspaper article that a Lady O'Donnell, and I don't know who that was, if it was Emma or Margaret, but a Lady O'Donnell came from Nebraska to visit her family and to put some shrubbery at her father's grave, Daniel's grave. So that's pretty neat. And they have descendants, they married, they had children, they had plenty of children, and their descendants are still living in Nebraska mostly. There's also some of them in Kansas. So it's spread all out. So their history is being told too. Michael, I already told a little bit of him. Michael came out of Michael married and he had kids. His family, when you see the family picture of his children, you would think they came walking straight out of Calcutta, India. Because their granddad was born in India. He was half Indian. And like I said, one of their descendants, Dave, he was at the reunion a couple of years ago. So the daughter, Ida, that's an interesting story too. And I'll come to that when I move on to the next thing I would like to talk about. And that are the so-called money that is supposed to be in the family but never ended up there. There was a saying, Beulah might maybe remember that a little bit, that we come from money. There was something going on there in the older generations there. I think Uncle Sam talked about it. Uncle Alex talked about it. We come from money. Okay, so that's interesting. So I researched that, and let me explain how that worked. So Henry, who was born in 1787 in India, his father was Henry Anderson O'Donnell. He's born in Ireland, and he came from a landowner family of the O'Donnells, and they lived a little bit north of Limerick. They were pretty wealthy, so there is estates and possessions and land that Henry would have been entitled to for being a direct descendant. Henry actually did get a share of that wealth through his father when he died in 1840. His father, Henry Anderson O'Donnell, left him £500 sterling, which is an equivalent of $50,000. So the O'Donnell family actually did get a share of that part of the O'Donnell wealth. So let me clarify that. So it's not like Henry got the short end of the stick here. He didn't. He did get a share. It wasn't a big share, but he did get a share. Now, at that time, and I'm talking about the turn of the century, the late 1800s, beginning 1900s, there was a misunderstanding with Ida, Daniel's daughter, and her mother, Daniel's wife, Nancy Jane Cope, they were under the impression that Henry was a brother of Columbus O'Donnell. Columbus O'Donnell, and that's for most of you probably the first time you hear that name. Columbus O'Donnell was the son of Henry Anderson O'Donnell's brother. So Henry and Columbus were not brothers, they were cousins. But there was a misconception with Ida and Nancy Jane, so Daniel's family, that they were brothers. And it happened to be that Columbus O'Donnell exploited his father's, John O'Donnell's, wealth when he came to Baltimore to a vast amount of properties and money, stocks, interests, and everything. He owned the gas company in Baltimore. He owned a water company in Baltimore. He had stocks in the railroad, the B&O Railroad. He had stocks in the gas company. He owned a bank. So he was extremely wealthy, Columbus. Now, together with the misconception that Henry and Columbus were brothers, Ida and Nancy Jane assumed that Henry should have been entitled to part of Columbus's inheritance, which is based on a misconception because they were not brothers, but they didn't know that. And at that time, Ida lived in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, Ida and Nancy Jane, who lived in Nebraska too, they organized a party, a trip from Nebraska to Baltimore. Uncle Alex went along with them, and also went along Uncle Alex's son, Daniel Smith O'Donnell, who came from Ohio. And now you can imagine, I'm talking about 1917 here when that happened. At that time, that was a pretty big undertaking. There's people from the other side of the country pretty much coming to Baltimore, picking somebody up in Perry County, where Alexander lived, and his son that came from Ohio. So there was people from the family coming from several directions, and they all went to Baltimore. They hired one of the most renowned lawyers in Baltimore, Mr. Gerhardt, to lay claim on Columbus's estate. And that's where the story ends, because after that, now it was big in the newspapers at the time, both in Nebraska, in Omaha, it was in the newspapers, also in Baltimore, it was in the newspapers, that there was an O'Donnell family coming to Baltimore to lay claim on Columbus's O'Donnell, who was a celebrity in Baltimore, who in the meantime already died. He died in 1870, to lay claim on his inheritance. So it was a big story back then. But that's the last I could find on him. There was no follow-up, because I was looking for a lawyer that was getting with the O'Donnell family of Baltimore to lay that claim. I assume that lawyer Gerhardt did some research and found Columbus's will, which is about this big of a book. That's his will. And found out that Henry was not his brother. And that's where that story ends. So if Uncle Alex and Uncle Sam thought, and Ida and Nancy Jane Cope, if they thought that they were brothers and could lay claim on that wealth, that it was based on a misconception, and that didn't go through because it wasn't true.
How did it come that they thought they were brothers? Was it just a rumor, or was it their intention that they wanted to make it like he was his brother, or
They lived together?
Did
I don't know.
just
No,
think it?
no,
They didn't live
no. Henry at that time we'll talk. Well, Henry was dead in 1917. Henry was already dead. So, but no, Henry lived in Perry County pretty much all his life, except for the next story I'm going to tell. What I think what happened is that this is just assumption because it's hard to find out.
Right.
We happen to know that Henry went to Baltimore to visit Columbus. And there might have been, and of course they talked, they chatted. Of of course. There might have been something said between the two, something like, "We are like brothers. My father and your father were brothers, so we are like brothers." It can be a very small thing that was said, that was brought home, that Henry, when he came home, told his kids and his family. I went to visit Columbus, and we had a good chat. We spent a couple of days together there, in Baltimore, and we're like brothers. And through the generations, that might have changed into, "We are brothers." It's hard to tell how that came about. It's hard to tell. So now, Ida did bring up to a news reporter who was writing an article for a newspaper that she got her knowledge that they were brothers because of a brother that lived in the mountains in the west. There was no name or nothing mentioned. A mysterious brother. And he received a letter 20 years prior, so somewhere around 1895, 1897. He received a letter where somebody was inquiring about the inheritance of Henry and Columbus O'Donnell. And that's how they got the idea,
Oh,
we
okay.
need to go to Baltimore. So it might have something to do with that. There's one complication though, because Nancy Jane Cope and Daniel only had 7 children. One died of typhoid fever, Rebecca, and the other 6 are all accounted for. So who was the brother that lived in the West? I still haven't been able to find him. So I have no idea who that might be. No clue whatsoever. All the other kids are accounted for. So I don't know. I don't know who that was. So, but apparently there was a letter going around that was talking about, was inquiring about the inheritance of Henry and Columbus. So, now Dave, who was here at the reunion a couple of years ago, who is a direct descendant of Daniel, he told me the story about an old story that went around in his line of the family. Because I started talking to him about Nancy Jane Cope, and Dave told me, "Oh now brings back memories." Somebody told me that she was always called Crazy Grandma Nancy. That was her name, Crazy Grandma Nancy. And so I asked him, "Well, now where did that come from?" Well, and Dave told me that they went to Baltimore with her daughter Ida and with Alexander and Alexander's son. Nothing came out of it. And then she came home and she grabbed all the paperwork that she had, that she took along, including probably the letter that mysterious brother in the West received. She came home and she was mad and she was angry and she destroyed all the paperwork, and supposedly she said, "If I'm not going to get any money, nobody is getting any money." And she just threw all the paperwork away. So, yeah. So I wish she wouldn't have done it, because we might have found a little bit of paperwork there, but yeah. So, maybe something interesting on the side. Ida married 3 times. She had plenty of children. One of her sons is Merle Jones. At that time, he was the CEO of CBS Television Network. So, if you're looking for a famous person in your branch of the O'Donnells, there you have him. Merle Jones.
Is
Yeah.
Nora O'Donnell in there anymore? Get her off of CBS.
Now, 3 years later, and that's interesting too, in 1920, there appears a letter from a Margaret Wilson, writing the National Archives in Washington, D.C., inquiring about Henry's pension files. Because maybe the names of his parents are mentioned in his pension files, so it would make it possible to lay claim on the O'Donnell legacy. That's what said in the letter. Now, Margaret Wilson happens to be Daniel's daughter, Margaret, who was sent to an orphanage, of who I lost track for a long time. And that's how I found her. That's Margaret Wilson, because she married a Wilson. So 3 years later, 3 years after the one daughter, Ida, tried to get money by going to Baltimore, her sister Margaret tried it again. So I got the letter. I also got a letter from the archives telling her that names of parents are not mentioned in pension files of the army. It's just the soldier. And whoever is claiming some benefit or some funds. So usually the widows or the children, but not the parents. So that was a dead end too. So that didn't work out. So as far as we come from money, yes, it's true, definitely. But it's not based on Ida's or Nancy Jacobs or Margaret Wilson's conception that Columbus and Henry were brothers. But the O'Donnell family comes from money through the Irish properties, of which Henry did get a share, $50,000. Now, you might wonder, since Henry Anderson O'Donnell, Henry's father, retired to Ireland, writes his will in Ireland in 1840, he dies in Ireland in 1840. I mean, nowadays we just pull a plastic thing and we throw it in some machine, and I can send $20 to China in 2 seconds, you know what I mean? So, but back then in 1840, that was not as easy as it sounds. So how do you get $50,000 from Ireland to somebody of which nobody knows where he actually is at? Because nobody knew where Henry was. He disappeared. So knowing that Columbus was a well-known businessman in Baltimore, knowing that he owned a bank, and knowing that Columbus knew family in Ireland, I assumed if there's one way, it almost has to be through that Columbus. That money must have went through Columbus. The family in Ireland probably found or contacted Columbus. We have $50,000 here. How are we getting that to Henry? And Columbus probably said, I'll know a way. And sure, he did. So a couple of years ago, we went to Ireland. We visited the Limerick archives. They have almost 700 documents on the O'Donnell family, your O'Donnell family. We went to every single document. Took us a day and a half. After half a day, it was close to lunch. We were just about heading out for lunch to come back later to resume our search. We found a letter in the Limerick archives in Ireland, and the letter was written by Columbus O'Donnell, and it was sent to Henry's brother, Charles Rutledge O'Donnell, in Ireland. And that explained the whole thing. And I have the letter on my laptop. It's too hard to read, so I'm not going to bring it up trying to read it to you guys. It's going to take too long. So I wrote down a transcript. So I'm going to read it to you what that letter says. So this is Columbus writing to his cousin in Ireland, Charles Rutledge O'Donnell. I have, with some management, induced my uncle's son, John O'Donnell. Now he means Henry O'Donnell, and this is how we found out that Henry's real name is John Henry O'Donnell, because Columbus calls him John. To invest his legacy, left to him by his father, the £500 or $50,000, in a good little productive farm in Pennsylvania, secured in trust for himself during life, and afterwards to his family. The land is good, the farm contains about 150 acres, and will give him and his family a comfortable living. He was much pleased with the arrangement and is now quite comfortable and happy. So this is Columbus explaining that Columbus was instrumental in receiving the money from Ireland and investing it, together with Henry, in a farm for Henry and his family. So that explains that. So some of the O'Donnell wealth from Ireland, to which Henry was entitled, actually made it to Henry. And it was invested, thanks to Columbus's help, in a little farm. And the farm was in Turbot Township, close to Port Royal. And that, we're never able to find a farm there, but we did find the tax records. Actually, we found the tax records before we went to Ireland. And in the tax records, in the Juniata County Historical Society, they name Henry O'Donnell as a farmer, as taxable, but also a Columbus O'Donnell. We already knew that is Columbus O'Donnell from Baltimore. We know that, that's Columbus. So what's Columbus doing on those tax records of Turbot Township? He's in Baltimore. But that kind of like gave us a hint. Columbus has something to do with Henry as far as Henry's inheritance. So we found that out later through that letter we found in the Limerick archives. Then the letter goes on, and it gives a little bit of detail too, which is interesting. One of his sons came to see me with him. That almost has to be your direct ancestor, William. So William went with his father Henry to Baltimore to meet Columbus. One of his sons came along with him. A young man, about 20, good looking.
Well,
I mean, now you know where you get your looks from. Good looking, quite well educated, which is important. We are talking here about, the letter was written in 1844. Schooling for kids was not common, especially when you were a boy. When you were 12, you were out on the land, you were working, you were helping your parents. But he was quite well educated. So Henry, it's kind of like an indication that Henry, he did take care of his kids, and Henry probably did what he could do for his kids. Quite well educated, industrious, and with quite a, and there's a word in the original text I can't decipher, with quite a appearance. So he must have left a pretty good impression on Columbus. I think the most has been made with the small amount he had to receive. So even Columbus admits it was just a small amount that he received, but he did receive something. John, so Henry, this is interesting, has joined the Temperance Society. Everybody familiar with the Temperance Society is?
No.
Anti-drink.
I've heard of it, but I don't.
Nowadays they call it the AA,
Yeah.
Alcoholic Anonymous.
Anti-drinking.
Yeah. So he has joined the Temperance Society. And he has been a strict teetotaler. Teetotaler is kind of like a British word. It means he doesn't drink at all. He has been a strict teetotaler, as we say, for 2 years. The consequence is he dresses better, looks better, and gets on quite well with his family. So that's Columbus describing John Henry for us. So now we know a little bit about John Henry. Now we know how he got his inheritance from Ireland. We know.
That's about his name.
Now we also know that Columbus knew Henry, because Columbus, he was a rich person in Baltimore. What business would he have had with a poor saddler in New Germantown, of all places? But there is the connection, and they knew each other. And on the sideline, I want to mention that, and that's pretty interesting, that Charles Rutledge O'Donnell, Henry's brother, who lived in Ireland, knew about Henry at least through this letter from Columbus. We're talking 1844. But Charles Rutledge O'Donnell, being a genealogist himself, never ever mentioned with a single word his brother anywhere. He even drew up a family tree, a pedigree tree, which is actually even deposited at the King of Arms in Ireland, which makes it official, which means that the King of Arms in Ireland accepts it as being true. It's research, it's a true tree. Even in that tree, our Henry does not appear. I have a lot of correspondence of Charles Rutledge. There's no Henry in there. He completely ignores his own brother. So, and he cannot say that he didn't know he had one, because he knew. So that's interesting to know too.
Well, Sylvie always, I think it was Sylvie that said that he was disinherited because he turned Protestant instead of Catholic, staying Catholic. I don't know if there's any.
I can't find nothing on that. I find subjects on that, on religious related issues within a family, when you go a little couple of generations further back. Because Ireland used to be, still is, very Catholic. But as you know, Ireland was occupied by England in the generations before Henry and Henry Anderson. We're talking about a century before that. So somewhere around the early 1700s, mid 1700s. And England was Protestant. So to the point where the Irish people were not even allowed to own land. They were not allowed to own anything, pretty much. It was all British, unless you turned Protestant. So maybe a family story came through there somehow. Maybe that trickled through. You know what I mean? So, but as far as my research about Henry and whatever happened after that and at his time, we didn't come across anything religious as far as that goes. So
Maybe because he was a drunkard.
no.
You said
No,
about
Henry.
it.
Henry got a share of the O'Donnell inheritance. There's no doubt about it. He got $50,000. And the reason why he got only a small amount is probably because he was illegitimate. He came from, he was born out of wedlock. And that was a big thing, especially in Catholic Ireland. You remember that Henry Anderson O'Donnell, he was a Catholic too. That was his son. And he was born to a mistress, so it was out of wedlock. But as it was common back then,
Yeah.
with British soldiers who served in India, who a lot of them had an Indian mistress, and a lot of them had children. And even nowadays, there are even whole societies of British Indian descendants, both in India and in Great Britain, that are still they still exist. They share the same ancestry as our Henry. They have a mixed ancestry there. So those soldiers, they had a lot of children, but being British or being Irish, they took care of their children as far as recognizing them, especially when they were a son. So even though Henry was born to an Indian mistress, however from Persian royal descent, but still an Indian mistress, out of wedlock, Henry Anderson still gave him a name, John Henry O'Donnell. He didn't end up in an Indian name. He was not ignored. Henry Anderson didn't say like to the mistress, "That's your son, I am," Henry Anderson recognized him, and he gave him his last name, O'Donnell. And he is even recognized in his will. So he did get a share, but he was illegitimate.
That was probably what.
That's
the
probably.
brother didn't think he was.
Well, I think the brother. That's pure speculation
Yeah,
because.
But that would make sense, though.
Yeah, I think Charles Rutledge O'Donnell, so Henry's brother in Ireland, and that's kind of funny because, you would think when Henry Anderson dies, everything would go to his son. But his wife was still living too, Henry Anderson's wife, because he married after he had a mistress in India. He married in Ireland, or he married in India and then retired to Ireland. So he was married. So he gives everything to his wife, not to his son. And his wife, after Henry Anderson dies, his wife marries again to a Mr. Thomas Wilkinson. Now, the wife was already very old, and even in the same letter that I just read, Columbus refers to her, and I didn't write it down because I didn't think I was getting to talk about that, but Columbus writes about her that he heard a rumor going around in the family that the old bat is going to remarry. Tell me, please, Charles Rutledge, it's not true. Surely she's insane, and she should be in an insane asylum. So
we get it honest.
and she was already high in age there, so when she remarried. Now, and I just recently, I think like 2 weeks ago, I was kind of like looking into that, and sure enough, the Irish properties of the O'Donnell family, after Henry Anderson's death, refer to his wife, but since his wife remarried to Thomas Wilkinson, suddenly in tax records in Ireland of the Irish properties of the O'Donnell family, guess who is there as pretty much the owner? Thomas Wilkinson.
Yeah.
Not Henry Anderson's wife, Thomas Wilkinson. So there is Charles Rutledge, probably pretty frustrated by this time, because he was kind of like hoping, I'm going to, my dad dies, and now it's going to be all mine. Then the will comes out. First he finds out he has a brother. That's
Now,
not good.
Is she his mother?
The second wife. No. Charles Rutledge
Okay,
is...
now who's the oldest? The illegitimate, the oldest.
Henry is the oldest.
Okay.
Henry is the oldest. Yeah, Charles Rutledge was born 1792.
Okay.
And Henry 1787. Yeah. So
Yeah, I have to say jealousy.
So he gets the will from his father, of course, because he's his son, so he gets to read the will. There he reads that he's not going to get anything until his mother dies. Then he reads he has a brother. A brother means that's a contestant. That's a contestant. When my stepmom
Sounds like the
dies,
Boyer brothers.
then all hell is going to break loose, because that guy from America is going to find out, and he's going to lay claim, and then I might be out of half of it again. So that might be why he just completely ignores it. But like I said, this is pure assumption, because of course you're not going to write that down. I'm going to ignore my brother because you don't write that stuff down. So and another reason might be, if you see Charles Rutledge, and I should have taken a picture along, I was thinking about it so you can see him. Charles Rutledge is like, how do you say that in English?
Snooty.
He's snooty. He's uppity. They made a painting of him, and it was commissioned by the Queen of England.
That's who Biden was trying to paint.
And they painted him in his full military uniform.
Oh, wow.
British uniform. And we're talking about the 1820s, I think, it was painted. Now those uniforms back then were extremely elaborate, and he was already an officer. He was high up already. So there were sashes and gold and a big hat, and he was standing there like, I'm the man. I am Charles Rutledge O'Donnell. And I come from a very distinguished old Irish family. And I mean, when you live by yourself pretty much, he was married, but he didn't spend a lot of time with his wife anyway. So he was by himself most of the time. So when you're by yourself a long time and you start talking to yourself, you can make yourself believe anything you want, and that's probably what he did. So he thought of himself, I'm a pretty important person. And I don't want to have a brother that's illegitimate and is just a poor saddler somewhere in a dirty town like Philadelphia. I don't want to be connected to that. So that might be another reason. But it's all speculation. We don't know. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
As far as that painting goes, though, I think in that time period, especially, like, because he didn't commission it, it was commissioned by someone else. For the most part, I think that when they paint people from that time period, that's how they paint them.
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
he probably didn't have a whole lot of say in what they did, especially if it was commissioned by someone else. So
Yeah,
it's hard to tell if he came wearing all that stuff.
yeah, yeah. But I think he gladly
Well,
did it.
yeah, I'm
I
not
think he
saying
gladly
that.
did
Yeah,
it.
I'm sure he did.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
Because
knew
he would be the first O'Donnell to be
Right.
painted from the family. So I
Right.
mean, he had every reason to be very proud of, you know.
Well, that's a big deal too, to be, have a painting commissioned by the Queen of England of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, it's still in the possession of the Queen. It's in the
Oh,
Queen.
really?
It's in the Queen's personal collection. It's not on display anywhere. So I acquired. I got a picture of the painting, but I had to request it at the Queen's personal collection. They have their own kind of like museum, you know what I mean? So I had to write to them, and they sent me a picture about that big. So it's hanging on the wall. All right. So does anybody have any questions, or is something not clear, or is something?
Yeah, why don't you write the book?
I thought you were writing as I was speaking. Anybody have any questions about? Is everything clear? I mean, I take every opportunity to explain about the money thing, where the wealth came from. So I want to make clear that Henry actually did get at least a part of what was rightfully his, a share of the O'Donnell possessions in Ireland. All right. So now I get to the next subject. Hopefully it's not going to be that long. I don't want to tire you people too much. Now Henry, as we know, was born in 1787. He came to Baltimore in 1789. He was only 18 months old at that time. He was brought to Bucks County, close to Philadelphia, where he was raised by people that we don't know yet. Next time he pops up is in 1804, where he becomes indentured, how you call it, not a slave, an indentured student with a saddle maker in Philadelphia, Stephen Burroughs. Apprenticeship. There, that's the word I was. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, an indentured apprentice with Stephen Burroughs in Philadelphia. We were even able to find the house or the shop where Stephen Burroughs worked and where Henry worked in Philadelphia. So it's not even worth a picture, really. It's just 1 out of 1,000 houses in Philadelphia. So apprenticeship takes 7 years. He finishes it in 1811. He marries. He has his own little saddle shop in Philadelphia for a while. Then he joins the army for the War of 1812. Actually, he joins in 1814, but the war at that time was still going on. We're at the tail end of the war with the British at that time. So it's 1814, but they still call it the War of 1812. He is stationed in Camp Marcus Hook, a little bit south of Philadelphia. He's a guard there. He serves, I think, about 7 months, returns home, and disappears in 1817 suddenly off the stage. He's not in Philadelphia anymore. He's gone. We know where he went. He went to Perry County. So what happened between 1811 and 1817? And this is really my newest discovery. It turns out that Henry was married for the first time in Philadelphia already. He was married to a Hannah Molador, and they had 2 children, Elizabeth and Henry. Elizabeth marries at Davenport. There's a whole big tree coming down from that line, and the son Henry has 8 children. So Henry, our Henry, the Sadler, has 8 grandchildren through Henry in Philadelphia. They are William Henry, Sarah Ann, George Molador O'Donnell, Hannah, Mary Elizabeth, Josephine, Anna, and John. 8 children. Now I'm not going to tire you guys with the story of each one of them, but one of them jumps out there, and that's William Henry, because he has children, and then he has children, eventually ending up with William Henry Jr. And he was born in 1856, and they're still living in Philadelphia. He marries a Mary Ella Helme, but on July 18th, 1891, they divorce. They did have a son, William Henry III. Still all O'Donnells, all directly related to you guys. William Henry III. He was born in 1881. Now here comes a story in play that Patsy told me a couple of years ago when we met her and talked about the O'Donnell family. And Patsy told us something about a letter that was received in which somebody said that they should not be alarmed, the reader of the letter, when at some day soon they might read about a fight with Italians. Now, when it's a letter, it means that it comes from further away than New Germantown. It comes from further away than Harrisburg. Because, you know, that's close enough to meet up with somebody to tell something like that. The letter came from somewhere else, from further away. I think that letter came from Philadelphia, from the family in Philadelphia. Because William Henry III was killed in Philadelphia by a man named Giuseppe Spallone in Italian. And it was not an accident. And I found newspaper articles on that murder, what exactly happened. Turns out that William Henry III, so your Henry's great-great-great-grandson, somewhere there, was walking down the street with a couple of companions in Philadelphia, and they bumped into an Italian that was leaning up against a fence. At that moment, when William Henry bumped into that Giuseppe pulled a knife and stabbed him in his neck and severed pretty much all the blood vessels in his neck. Henry died a couple of minutes later. So, that's what happened. Newspaper articles do not explain anything, why it happened, what was the motive of the murder. All they said is that Giuseppe Spallone came to America by himself. He was a hard-working man, lived in Philadelphia for a while, for years already. He had a wife and children in Italy who he was planning to bring over to the States once he was settled. So he was already married and had children. Now I found in an old diary or record book of a clergyman, so to give you an idea how deep sometimes I have to dig to find something, I found a little booklet in which is mentioned the death of William Henry III, because that clergyman records the burial. But and that's usually what a pastor or a preacher writes down in the diary: the name, the date, and where buried, what cemetery. That's it. But with William Henry III, the clergyman found it necessary to add that Giuseppe Spalloni, the Italian, was married to William Henry III's mother, to William Henry III's mother. And they had a child.
Oh, man.
So, to me, it sounds like that William Henry III was kind of like a little bit peed off at that Italian guy, of which he knew that he was already married and was planning on bringing his own family over from Italy. That Italian guy just butts into the O'Donnell family, marries his mother, of all people, and even have a child. So, and as we know, most of the O'Donnells, maybe some of you guys, are pretty feisty, always up for a fight somewhere. So I think that William Henry III intentionally bumped into that Italian guy. That the Italian guy knew it was going to happen because he was leaning up a fence. Now, why would you do that? Are you waiting for something? Apparently he was. He knew William Henry III was going to come flying around the corner, picking a fight. And that's exactly what happened. Only William Henry got the short end of the stick because he was the one that got killed, not the Italian guy. And it's kind of funny because I usually put all this on Ancestry in the O'Donnell tree, just so I can get a clear look at how it actually looks like who's the father, who's the mother, who are the children. And then I find other trees that have the same people in their tree, finding that the child that Giuseppe Spalloni had with William Henry III's mother, who was clearly born while Giuseppe Spalloni was in the States, that child, his name is Donato Spalloni was the child, the son, where his mother is the woman that still lives in Italy. While I think okay, so when the woman is still in Italy, how can that be her son to Giuseppe Spalloni, who is in America? That's not possible. So, and I think that was the story that was announced in the letter that Patsy was talking about. So I was hoping that Patsy would have been here, so I could have asked her, and if I would have told her the story, maybe something would have dawned on her that might well be. Now this is a little interesting story. What's more important is that there's a big O'Donnell family here in Mifflin County, Perry County, State College, you name it, Center County, Huntingdon County. There's a big O'Donnell clan over here, okay? And there's an O'Donnell clan in Philadelphia. And they all come down from Henry, the same ancestor. Did they know about each other? Now, if that is true, that letter is talking about this incident, about William Henry III, and William Henry III writes that letter to family over here, that means that the O'Donnells over here knew the O'Donnells in Philadelphia. Those two families, they were in contact. And that's something I would like to find out next. So, and that's where I'm at right now with my research. So if you guys have old letters laying in a shoebox somewhere in an attic that might refer to something like this, I will be very happy to. Okay, so very, very short. I did a lot of research on the actual roots of the O'Donnell family in Ireland. There's a huge misconception that we descend from the famous Donegal O'Donnells, the Red Ewe, and I don't know who all. The famous, I don't know if you saw it, the coat of arms with the hand with the cross. Forget about it. It's not true. It's not true. Your O'Donnell family comes from a merchant family in Limerick, and I was able to trace the roots back to the early 1600s. That's as far back as I can go. And those O'Donnells had a salt pan in the River Shannon, that runs from the west coast of Ireland through Limerick. A salt pan is where they harvested, as they call it harvest. They harvest salt, which was extremely important back then to preserve food. So there were a lot of salt houses also in Limerick. Salt was very valuable, was almost as valuable as gold. So if you had the salt pan and you had the salt house filled with salt, you were rich. You were rich. So they owned a salt pan, salt houses, and to make it more confusing, the owner of that was John O'Donnell, and I think he had a son Henry. I'm just joking, I don't know. But you see the same names coming back all the time. So they were west of Limerick, and I think the origins of your O'Donnell family came from probably County Kerry, which is all the way on the west coast of Ireland, on the west of Limerick, southwest pretty much. And they migrated slowly up the Shannon and ended up in Limerick as merchants. And the land that they owned, of which your Henry in the end received a small share, was acquired through marriage, through a marriage between an O'Donnell and Stritch, Christian Stritch. I thought that would be a male name, Christian, but actually at that time was a female name, Christian. So it's not Christiana or Christy, it was Christian. Christian Stritch. Her father owned the land, and in his will, which we saw at the Limerick Archives, a will from 1712, where the land is actually written to John O'Donnell. So that's how the O'Donnell family acquired the land in Ireland, and that's where your Henry's share in the end came from, the $50,000. So thanks to the Stritch family, Henry had a little farm in Turbot Township. And I can go on and on and on. I mean, this is what I wrote down, which is just a little part of what all the stuff I found out. I want to close with John O'Donnell from Baltimore. Whoever watches the news or reads the newspaper recently, I think it was in May this year, John O'Donnell had a statue in Baltimore, in John O'Donnell Square, because of the recent happenings from last year between the white and the black community around this country. They decided to tear down John's statue because he was a slaveholder. It's funny because a mile and a half up the road there is a big statue on a big pillar, and it overlooks whole Baltimore. It's a statue of George Washington. I think he was one of the biggest slaveholders in the area, but he's still standing there, so I don't know. I have no opinion, but it's strange. Anyway, so John O'Donnell, and that's what I'm going to close with. We visited his tomb in Baltimore. It's a pretty neat tomb. It's tucked away behind or next to a church. You can't find it. You really have to know where it's at. He's buried in the same cemetery as Edgar Allan Poe, by the way. There was somebody that wrote a book about 50 years ago that said that John O'Donnell, because it's not just John that was buried there, also his wife is buried there, his mother-in-law was buried there, his two first sons who died in infancy are buried there. So it was kind of like a family tomb. But somebody wrote a book writing that all the remains were removed from that tomb and brought to another, reinterred in another cemetery, Greenmount Cemetery. So I could have let that go, take it for the truth, whatever, you know. Just leave the man in peace wherever he's buried. But I researched it, and so we went to Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, and they have a very meticulous, very well kept archive. And there's a hawk watching it, an old woman, a hawk. You cannot
Real
get
bad.
past her.
Real bad.
You stand in front of her desk and you have to tell her what you need. And if she feels like it, she will look it up for you. That's the impression she left on me. But we asked her, she couldn't find nothing about a John O'Donnell or anybody of his family buried in that cemetery except Columbus O'Donnell. Columbus O'Donnell is actually buried there with members of his family, but no John O'Donnell, not John O'Donnell's wife. So, tried to contact the writer of the book, who never replied to my messages. So we were still in the dark. Where are John O'Donnell's remains? So I tried to find out who the caretaker was of the cemetery in Baltimore, in John O'Donnell's tomb, where John O'Donnell's tomb is, and got in contact with her. They were very reluctant. They didn't know anything. They pretty much, well, we mow the grass pretty much. That's what we do. But for the rest, we don't know. I kept persisting, like every couple of months. I wrote them an email or left them a message. And finally, what was it, last year? 2 years? Something like that. We got lucky, and the lady said, okay, I'm willing to meet you in Baltimore at the cemetery. That's as far as we got. So, okay, let's meet. So we went to Baltimore. We had to go there anyway. So we met her, and there she came out of the church that's built right on top of the cemetery, as a matter of fact, part of the cemetery, with a bundle of keys. And I can remember we were walking behind her, and I told my wife Vic, said, you see that? She has keys. That's a good start. So, so the caretaker actually did open the tomb for us, and which is very exceptional. And we were able to look inside the tomb, and it's a pretty, it's not big, probably size-wise about a shed, an average shed, something like that. It's 2 levels. You can clearly tell there was an old grave that had like a dome top on top of it. Probably where John's mother-in-law was buried, with John's 2 infant children that died. That was the very first tomb. John's tomb was built on top of it. It's kind of like a little house. And all I can tell you is that it was not empty. And there were clearly remains of at least 6 people in there. It was disturbed many times, but there are still human remains in there. And because it was disturbed and there were no other marks or indication, there are no coffins, they're all decayed. The only way you can find out if John is actually still in there is through DNA. So you actually have to get the bones out of there, and that goes too far for me. I just wanted to make sure that the tomb was not empty, like the woman wrote in her book. So as it stands now, we very, very strongly believe that John is still buried there. And I have a strong indication about that because descendants of John, they visited Baltimore, like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They visited Baltimore, and they met with Columbus himself and Columbus's children, and they write in their diaries and their stories and their letters that they were going to visit our great-grandfather's tomb at that cemetery. And somebody was actually staying with Columbus, telling Columbus, I'm going to visit your father's tomb. You would think that if John was not buried there anymore, he's in another cemetery, that Columbus surely would have told that person. But no, they all went to the old cemetery where John is still buried. So that's another indication that John was not moved. So I just wanted to give you guys that little bit of information there. So it gives you an idea, also a little bit an idea how far we actually go to do our research. We do not sit behind a computer all day long. Well, sometimes I do. But most of the time I just sit there and think. And we find 90% of our information through actual research, finding the actual documents. So everything I told you guys, I can show you the documents if you're interested. Some of them I have with me. I have some of them on the computer. So anybody else, you know where to find me if you have questions.
Well, thank you for
Anybody have
taking-
questions?
Thank you for taking time to do all that.
Absolutely, it's very interesting. I mean, it's a beautiful story. Altogether, it's a beautiful story, really. I mean, there are so many people that lived their lives and don't leave a trace because they just had average lives. What can you tell them about? You know, they were born, they went to school, they worked hard, they had kids, they raised their kids properly, and then they died. What's the story? Well, that's basically it. So yeah. I mean, when I first read that Henry O'Donnell was born in Calcutta, I mean, what do you think? There's a saddler from New Germantown that says he's born in Calcutta. I mean, honestly, who would not be tempted to spend at least half an hour trying to find a little bit more about him? You know what I mean? Now we spent about 6-7 years now trying to find out. So, and it just keeps on coming.
Maybe by next year you'll find them.
Who knows? He is buried in New Germantown, but the church there burned down. They built a new church. We have the strong impression that Henry's grave there has been, built on top of it, or just, So we don't know. Okay, that was it.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
very